Welcome to this series of talks, People, Purpose and Planet, where we invite you to rethink the future of development and humanity.
Oswaldo, thank you so much for being with us. Welcome to this series of talk, name, people, purpose, and planet. One of these topics is, of course, how we can rethink current policies. We have Oswaldo here because he's an expert and especially on drug trafficking. Let's jump directly to the first question, which is, please just share a little bit with us why you decide to go into this topic, what attracts you, what you're passionate more about it.
Thank you for for the invitation to be here. I'm very happy to share some ideas about my research and the work that I've been doing on drug trafficking. I am a professor of Latin American literature and culture. And before that, I spent several years as a reporter working in the US-Mexico border and also as a correspondent in Washington, D.C. And in that accumulated experience as a journalist and then as an academic, I started researching the way we think of and we look at drug trafficking in Mexico, in Latin America in general, but with a particular focus on Mexico. And what I found out from the start is that a lot of the cultural products that are out there concerning the drug trade repeat consistently the same narrative of what the problem is supposed to be. And it is this imagination that attracted me in the first place, the idea that drug trafficking is organized around this powerful collectives called cartels that, as you know, are portrayed, especially in official discourse, as very powerful organizations that are capable not only of challenging the state power, but actually surpassing it and causing major devastation, while at the same time leading a transnational global empire of illegal money and drugs and weapons. And so this narrative is what attracted my attention for several reasons, but the first one being that it is of official origin, right? So the narrative that we constantly refer to explain ourselves, the phenomenon of drug trafficking, has actually been articulated by state institutions first. And it is then, after it's been articulated by official sources, that it is in turn legitimized mostly by journalism covering these events. And then on a third level, it becomes a part of a cultural imaginary that we collectively circulate, disseminate, and consume. And so my research then has been focused on trying to understand this imaginary. How is it that it came to be into being? The original structures of power that first articulated it, and its implications generally in not only in policy, anti-drug policy, but also in the way that us as citizens accept or overtly consent to anti-drug militarization, for example, efforts in the name of this global struggle against the drug trade.
As you say, is imagination. This is what is the call, and of course, imagination also has the roots from somewhere else. Can you explain us a little bit, and of course to the community, a little bit of what are these roots from this imagination?
Striking about the narrative on drug trafficking and drug trafficking and its policy and the anti-drug policy is that it has very little to do with actual drugs itself in the start, right? And this is something that may shock a lot of people, right? So when we look at the way we conceive and we think of drug trafficking today, it's more related to an agenda that originates in the United States, that it is concerned more with national security and its implications than with actual drug trade. So the drug trade prohibition began, of course, in the early 20th century in the US and in Mexico, and that it has been in constant evolution and it's been rethought many times over in the US, and it has included, of course, different drugs, and it has expanded throughout history. But the way we imagine the drug trade currently does not really come from those original instances of prohibition, but rather from a security apparatus that began in 1947 when the US passed the National Security Act. And this law that, of course, emanated in the new world after the World War II, aimed at securing the hegemony and the power of the United States across the globe. And the way it was deployed was to be deployed. It's by conceiving this constant national security threats that would mobilize U.S. interests in many regions in the planet. Originally, in the 1940s, of course, the first global threat that the U.S. localized was the threat of global communism. And it was so for the subsequent decades up until the 1980s when, as we know, of course, the Soviet Union crumbled. And of course, in 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was clear that communism no longer posed this global threat that, as it was articulated from the point of view of the United States. And it is around those years, in the late 1980s, that President Ronald Reagan declared that a new international enemy was, suddenly in the horizon of the United States, which is, of course, drug trafficking. In 1986, President Reagan signed a presidential directive order to designate drug cartels as the new national security threat. And what has happened ever since, of course, is the radicalization of this understanding of drug trafficking as some sort of a global enemy that must be fought in different stages of war in places like Mexico, Bolivia, Colombia, Peru, and from the 1990s and on. This imagination of a war against drugs that now has been taken to the global stage has only radicalized. And so in the case of Mexico, Mexico resisted this idea for many decades, all the way through to the 2000s, when President Felipe Calderon in 2006, in perhaps some have argued in an effort to legitimize his very problematic presidency, as he won under the shade of electoral fraud, decided to embrace the U.S. Directive of fighting the drug trade with the military. And so it began a new era of anti-drug militarization that spread it all over the country, and that led to a profound devastation in human cost and destruction in the country. As we know that so far the count of homicides in Mexico has reached over 300,000 people dead and over 60,000 forced disappearances. So the argument here that I'm trying to make then is that this anti-drug militarization, this violence that we have seen, cannot be solely attributed to the drug traders or to people involved in the commerce of illegal drugs for many reasons. First, because up until 2006, when this militarization effort began, the homicide index in Mexico was actually declining. And throughout the previous decade, from 1997 until 2007, as you know, experts in criminology and who have studied the phenomenon closely have shown us, the homicide index was actually declining all over the country, including in those places where we most commonly associate the drug trade, such as Ciudad Juarez. And what you see instead is that it's only after the militarization that homicide became such a widespread, horrible, preoccupying problem in Mexico, all over the country. And so the idea here, of course, of my research is then to pose, I guess, a most focused question of how is it that we have come to interpret this violence, and why is it that we tend to think that it is the drug trade that has to be blamed for the violence, when most data, including statistical analysis done by several institutions, have shown that there's a direct correlation between the militarization, anti-drug militarization, and the rise in violence. So just to summarize it, the history of the drug trade in Mexico is one thing, but the history of the violence that we have seen and perceived in the last 12, 15 years has very little to do with the drug trade, and it's more directly related with this national security agenda that has been pushed from the United States into Mexico and that has forced the country to deploy its military against its own people.
So what I understood, Ian, please may correct me, is that from some national politics, it became a national policy, basically in the 40s in the United States, and this turns into a global policy, and again back into the countries basically producing these drugs as a part of the national politics. I can understand that is a global issue, and this will allow me to raise the next question. At which point we can differentiate the part of public policy, politics, and the history and the economy behind the drugs.
It's a complex question. Of course, the drug trade, as it actually happens in places like Mexico, has been has been studied very little from the point of view of journalism and academia. It's only recently that we have come to approach the drug trade itself. Right, it is very rare to find interviews with traffickers, to visit them in their place of work, and to understand this economy from a more national perspective. There's been, of course, many attempts and many random interviews with so-called sicarios, people who are trained to kill, or small-time producers, but there's very little understanding, at least in it is my opinion, on the way drug trafficking works as a national network. And perhaps the reason for this is that there is very little network to discuss to begin with, right? Most of the drug trafficking that happens in Mexico, it's usually guided by small groups that operate independently, that have very little connection among themselves, and that it is only in discourse that we tend to imagine this pyramidal operations that are supposed to have very complex structures and actors and even intelligence, as it is led to believe by official government. So my research then tends to separate these two things, right? So I do not focus so much on the actual drug trade as it happens, the thing in itself, primarily because there's very little data about it, as I said. And instead, what I do is I focus more on the way it is articulated from official institutions and the way it is perceived in the general public. And this worries me the most, because it is this discursivity, this narrative that is articulated in official discourse, and the way it is consumed by the public, that general policy is then deployed and accepted, right? So I'm really much concerned with the hegemony of the national security agenda of the United States in Mexico, as it permeates, guides, and ultimately defines things as the anti-drug militarization of the last decade. And so when I look back at the way the drug trade has been articulated and understood in Mexico, what you see is just the very radicalization of this imaginary, and not necessarily the radicalization of drug traffickers themselves, because like I said, there's very little data to prove that, right? It is basically impossible to demonstrate, for example, that somehow, and we don't know why, in 2007, these so-called drug cartels started fighting each other to a point that caused this extraordinary homicide rate in the nation, when this conflicts between the groups of traffickers had been always there present, since the early 70s, but never amounting to such destruction. And instead, so what I try to focus on is to challenge this idea of the drug cartel wars, and show instead that it is the militarization that becomes the very condition of possibility of violence. and the way this violence works, it operates in the country, and finally the way we accept and consent to this violence as citizens. And so what unites these things, the anti-drug policy and the way we come to accept its violence, is the national security discourse that insists on creating this common enemy between Mexico and the United States, that are the so-called drug cartels. So my work has been aimed at deconstructing this imagination, and to show that there's very little referentiality, very little actual actors and things that respond to the name of the drug cartel, and that instead it's just a narrative that has been deployed in the country, like I said, to modify, to guide, to define, ultimately to produce this radical violent understanding of the country, and the need to fight it through the military.
In Vienna, as you may already know it, exists this United Nations agency tackling drugs and crime. What could be the message from those persons working on multilateral level, analyzing this big problem, not only about drugs but also transactional crime?
We need to start rethinking the way we look at the drug trade for many reasons. First, because the current policy has failed to pacify any region of the world, and that has only ended up igniting and radicalizing violence that we have seen. What I just described in Mexico happened in Colombia, has happened in Peru, has happened in Venezuela, has happened all over the world. Anti-drug policy does not help social tissue, does not help easing the violence, but quite to the contrary, it exacerbates violence. So there's definitely a point, and I think most people studying the drug trade from any discipline would agree that the current policy has failed across the globe. Now, the second point that I would make is that while I welcome the decriminalization of drugs as an important agenda, and I applaud it and I support it wholeheartedly, of course, it is not the only factor related to the violence. The drug trade is just in many ways an excuse, a justification for the deployment of the U.S. national security apparatus all across the globe. Even global instances, such as, for example, the UN Office on the Drug Trade, that studies the drug trade, is heavily influenced by the hegemony of U.S. discourse on drugs. And so what I think needs to happen is a general rethinking of not only drug prohibition, but the way we tend to imagine this field of national security. Rather, the security question itself, I think, should be examined, because it is not just about the drug trade. It's also about migration. It's also about terrorism. It's also about just simply human beings doing something, right? And the articulation of these dangers that are constantly formulated and reformulated from the interest of the United States is, I believe, what activates constantly this idea of national security. So if we look back to the history of the concept itself of national security, what we will find, as I described from the beginning of this conversation, is that it is a structure of power that does not have a fixed content. And the reason why it does not have a fixed content, of course, is that it allows the U.S. Agenda to keep in motion, to keep moving forward as it feels and refills itself with different faces and threats, right? So originally we have, as I mentioned, global communism as the ruler of national security, and as it's deployed an entire world division between East and West, and once that fell, suddenly other threats out of the thin air were articulated in the late 80s, and then the 90s, and then the 2000s, right? And the names of these threats have varied, have changed, have very little in common with themselves, and yet we tend to assume that they are part of a whole that is constantly threatening social community, political societies and communities all across the planet. And I'm thinking, for example, the connection that has been insistently tried to be drawn between terrorism and drug trafficking. Since the late 80s, it has been the interest of the United States to make this connection, right? That drug trafficking and terrorism somehow become one as a national security threat, even despite the fact that there is no evidence whatsoever that terrorists have ever attempted to come through Mexico to then cross illegally into the United States. And so this idea that migration, terrorism, and drug trafficking are somehow embodied in one single actor has become a recurrent strategy for deploying this national security apparatus. So going back to your question, I believe that that instead of just focusing on how to deal with drug trafficking as a crime, what we need to really is to not only deconstruct the idea of drug trafficking as something that should be illegal and decriminalize it, of course, but to expand this question of national security and to try to deconstruct the very idea of security and to perhaps replace this signifier with something more conducive to our present times. So it could be perhaps how to pacify the country, how to find common ground, how to find a way back to humanity that makes people not illegal, but actual human beings that are in need of help, of shelter, of basic resources, and how to embrace our humanity back.
Osvaldo, I think that's all for today. We're so glad to have you with us. Thank you so much for contributing to this conversation about rethinking how we think about drugs, and of course towards a real sustainable development and towards people, purpose and plan. Thank you so much, Osvaldo. Have a nice day.